Hi, today we're going to be going through the TSA 2012 question, should convicted criminals be allowed to vote? So, with these aims in mind, and using our standard structure, feel free to pause the video if you need a refresher, let's get into it. As always, the first thing we're going to want to think about is sort of the terms of the question. In this question, what terms do you think we're going to need to define? So, I'd go with convicted criminals, because that could be ambiguous. So we're going to want to get rid of that ambiguity. What ways could we define this term? Well, you could say anyone ever convicted of any crime. So if you steal a loaf of bread to feed your family 50 years ago, you still would not now be allowed to vote. This seems over harsh, and maybe not something we'd want to go with because it would be pretty hard to argue for this point, for this statement. You might want to say anyone currently serving a jail sentence, but that doesn't seem to capture all convicted criminals, because there are people who are convicted criminals who aren't currently serving a jail sentence. Or you might want to say anyone ever convicted of serious crime. But then you'd want to ask yourself sort of what counts as serious. You might want to think about that. Each of these, as you can tell, has its benefits. Each has its sort of thorny issues, its problems. You want to pick one and say why we've picked it. We'll also want to define be allowed. I think here it's best to talk about be allowed by law, not by prison officers. Because if it's legal for convicted criminals to vote, but their prison officers don't let them, I think then we say the prison officers are doing something wrong. So we're talking about allowed by law. Should they be allowed by law? As always, we're going to want to bring in a lot of nuance, a lot of evaluation. It's way too easy to say criminals are bad, therefore their votes would be bad. Yes, there'll be some people who would like to see rape made legal, that sort of thing. But there are also, Nelson Mandela was a convicted criminal, and almost everyone agrees that he was a great person, and we would like to see him have a vote. So you want to consider issues like that with nuance. So we want to know, as always, what sort of answer the examiners are looking for. If you were asked this question in a conversation, you'd probably either say no, or you'd say yes, and then you'd give your reasons on both sides. You might consider one on the other if you're in conversation, so we'll do that here again. We'll use our pestle structure to come up with points for our side and for the other side. Would you like to do that now? Just take a moment, think of as many points as you can on one side and as many points as you can on the other. Feel free to pause the video and come back. So we're going to look at it yes, otherwise. So we're going to look at what if convicted criminals weren't allowed to vote? That would be very bad, therefore they should. That's possibly a good way of looking at it. Reversing the question, looking at the problems, and then deciding positive, yes, they should be allowed to vote. But let's look at the no side first. Well, if we don't allow them to vote, then that's a strong punishment. It will deter a lot of crime. They're not real citizens anyway, so they shouldn't be allowed to vote, you might argue. You might say criminals vote badly, so not having them vote would lead to better laws. Or you might say it's cheaper not to let them vote. Some of these points are stronger than others, as I'm sure you realise. This is not an exhaustive list, I'm sure you have some of your own. And on the yes side, we might look at, well, they should be allowed to vote in order to boost their rehabilitation. Yes, otherwise rehab declines, rehabilitation is harder. You might say yes, otherwise there might be accusations of racism, classism. You might say they have rights as humans, or human rights. I'll go over this distinction in just a little bit. Or you might say they have to vote, or it's less democratic. We'll look at a couple of points on each side in a bit more detail. But first, let's look at this distinction. So what actually is this distinction? What's the difference between moral rights, or rights as humans, and legal rights? That is to say, human rights. Well, can you think? Rights as humans would be rights actually deserve to be held by all humans. So rights that all humans deserve to have. That's not to say that all legal systems recognise these. Even if they're unrecognised by law, people can still deserve to hold these rights. Therefore, they're still rights as humans, or moral rights. They don't change. So the same person everyone now holds the same rights as everyone did 500 years ago, if we're talking about moral rights. That may be freedom, the right to life, things like that. Legal rights, or human rights, are rights recognised by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. They're recognised by legal systems. They may be wrong, because this was written by humans, and humans are often fallible. So what legal rights aim to do is map onto moral rights. They aim to label all the same rights as moral rights, but they may get it wrong. They may do too many or too few. Still, it can be good to follow legal rights, because it's good to follow the law in general, even if the law may be wrong. So that's why we can talk about legal rights in a should context. Remember, this question is a should question, so we need to justify our use of legal rights. It's okay because legal rights can be good to follow even if they're wrong. Some examples of articles of the UDHR that might be relevant here. Well, the big one's Article 21, which says that everyone has the right to everyone has the right to decide how they're governed, either directly or through a representative. So that's the difference between human rights and legal rights, and it's quite a useful one to know for various essays. First, let's look at the side that says convicted criminals should not be allowed to vote. We're going to use our why, so what counter-argument structure. First point, it offers a strong deterrent. Can you think why? Well, people want power. That's a pretty decent assumption. And votes give power in our democratic systems. So, because people want power and votes give power, people want votes. So it's pretty fair to say that people don't want to lose their votes. Because people don't, you might ask, so what? You might say, because people don't want to lose their votes, there are fewer crimes, because there's a big deterrent, if doing crime will make them lose votes. Can you think of a counter-argument to this, though? Well, crimes are already disincentivised. We already don't want to commit crimes, typically. If we do, it's because we're irrational or because the reward is really, really great, like a bank robbery. So there might be fewer crimes, but there might not be, because it may be that crimes are only committed by people who aren't thinking rationally anyway. So this disincentive doesn't matter. A second point would be that criminals are not real citizens anymore. Can you think why? Well, maybe the state exists to protect citizens, so that's its job, is to protect its citizens. Crimes constitute attacks on citizens, and we don't like attackers. Attackers are our enemies of the state. You might ask, so what? Well, it seems fairly obvious. We shouldn't give enemies of the state. We shouldn't give them power over our state, because they'll do bad things to it. They'll take advantage of it. So we shouldn't give criminals votes, because votes are power. You might think of a counter-argument to this. There are a couple here, but there are many more, as with all these points. Well, you might say crimes don't equal attacks. We can think of some crimes that aren't attacks on other people. Say personal drug use is currently a crime, but it's not an attack on other people. So we might say crimes are not the same as attacks. We might say attackers are not the same as enemies. Even if someone assaulted someone 50 years ago, that doesn't mean they are currently an enemy of the state now. So we might think about time and consistency and that sort of thing. Let's look at the other side. Let's use our why, so what counterexample structure on the other side now. Looking at, for example, the point that if we don't give them votes, they'll find rehabilitation much harder. Let's ask why. Can you think why? Well, if they don't have a vote, you might argue, they're not full citizens. And if they're not full citizens, they might find it pretty hard to integrate into society. Why do we care about that, you might think? You might think criminals don't deserve to integrate into society. So what? Well, it can lead to social exclusion, which you might argue is bad of itself. And social exclusion might mean you find it hard to get a job, or you feel left behind by society, so either you commit crime to get money, or you commit crime because you have nothing else to do. This leads to a cycle. So, crime leads to conviction, conviction leads to losing votes leads to social exclusion leads to more crime, which leads to losing votes. So, we might think this would be a very bad system. A couple of counter-arguments. You might say you don't need the vote to reintegrate. We only vote in the UK every 5 years, for example, normally. So it doesn't matter if you can't have a vote. You can still lead a life as a full citizen, even if you have no vote. So this first point can be struck off. You could also argue that once you've lost your vote once, more crime won't lead to you losing the vote again, so it won't be a cycle. You could also say that this system might be a system. You could also say that a system that doesn't give convicted criminal votes might be racist or classist, so we should allow them votes. Why? Well, that's what the alpha's doing, is being proportionate, a disproportionate number of black and minority ethnic people and people with low incomes are convicted for various reasons. So structural inequality, subconscious bias from judges, that sort of thing. Now, taking the vote away from minorities and low income people, if they're convicted, will result in fewer minorities and low income people having a vote. So what, you might ask? Well, it gives minorities less power. This is a bad thing. Minorities already have little power, as you can tell from the fact that they are minorities. Now, laws already benefit the already privileged, because that's how structural inequality works. Now, if we give minorities even less power by taking a disproportionate number of their votes away, this will benefit the already privileged even more, and we could set up another cycle. That would be bad. So, you might think of a counterexample or counterargument to this. You might say criminals don't represent minority views anyway. So even though they are minorities and they are criminals, they are more criminals than they are minorities, and they represent a criminal viewpoint, not a minority viewpoint. Again, we're going to want to think of our nuance in this point and think not all convicted criminals are awful people. Many of them do it for reasons such as poverty or lack of education, so you might want to think about how strong this counter-argument actually is. I hope that's all been helpful.